Hello, I'm Anika from Made to Sew. In this class, I'm going to be showing you step by step how to sew the tie neck halter neck top. If you would like to draft this pattern from your basic bodice block or from a basic starting point, then you can join me in the drafting tutorial first, which I will pop a link to here. This top is a halter neck style with a trapeze shape, and it has a lining and a tie neckline that is cut on the bias to sort of resemble a scarf. You can choose to make this top in a variety of different fabrics, and the fabric that you choose will give you a slightly different look and feel. The blue fabric that I'm using is a silk cotton organdy, so it is a little bit crisp. If you choose to work with something like a silk chiffon, a silk georgette, a silk crepe de chine, of course your fabric will have more drape. You can also choose to cut the garment on the bias if you prefer. So grab the fabric that you're working with and we can begin. So I've gone ahead and cut out the following from my fabric. I have a garment front. This can be cut on the straight of grain or on the bias. 2 garment backs, again cut on the straight of grain or the bias. The front hemband, which is cut on the fold, the back hemband, which is cut on the fold. My lining pattern pieces, 1 front cut on the fold and 2 backs with a centre back seam. Again, these can be cut on the straight of grain or on the bias. And finally, the necktie. My necktie is cut on the bias, so I'm going to keep it attached to the pattern for as long as possible. You will also need a piece of binding. The binding should measure 2.5 centimeters, 1 inch in width, and longer than your neckline. Your front neck plus your back neck measurements times 2, plus some extra for seam allowances. Depending on the fabric that you're working with, you may wish to stabilize the armholes and the neckline of the garment. You can use some stay tape or you can complete some stay stitching. Because my fabric is sheer, you would be able to see the stay tape. Therefore, I'm going to be cautious with my handling instead. We're going to begin by sewing a French seam. We need to do this at the 2 side seams of the front and the back hembands, the 2 side seams of the front and the back body, and the 2 side seams of the front and the back lining. If you're new to sewing French seams, then I do have a specific how to sew a French seam video, which I'll pop a link to here. I recommend marking the centre back of the hemband with a pin or some chalk so that you know which of the hembands is the back and which is the front. To sew our French seam, we're going to begin by placing the materials wrong sides together. Before you start sewing, it's a good idea to consider the fabric that you're working with. Complete a test at your sewing machine and if appropriate, change your needle. I'm working with a small Microtex needle and decide on the presser foot of choice. I'm using the dual feed function on my sewing machine, which is like a walking foot. For a 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch seam, the first seam that I will sew is 5 millimeters. If I'm working with imperial measurements, it will be a generous 1/8 of an inch. Move the sewing machine needle and decide on the best presser foot to use for accuracy. You can try a 1/4 of an inch quilting foot, or you can copy me. I move my needle, find a guideline and check my measurements with a ruler. If you struggle with your sewing machine to start sewing this or to sew the entire seam, then I recommend that you use some tissue paper or some tearaway stabilizer to either just help at the beginning of the seam or for the entire seam. Backstitch at the start and at the end. We're going to need to trim, and I usually prefer to press my seam allowances open as well. If I'm working with metric, I will trim my seam allowances to about 3 millimeters, approximately half the width that I've sewn. If I'm working with imperial, then I potentially won't need to trim my seam allowances. I usually prefer to press my seam allowances open first, because once they're trimmed smaller, this can be tricky. The key here is that the seam allowances need to be smaller than the second seam, so that when you sew them, you can't see the seam allowances pushing through that finished seam. Then I usually press my seam in position with the right sides of the fabric together, ensuring that the seam is sitting right along the edge of the fabric. The pressing steps are optional because with some fabrics you can finger press them and that will be sufficient. So it depends on the fabric that you're using and the accuracy you want to achieve in this project. Then I will sew the seam again at the sewing machine. For my metric measurements, I will sew the second 5 millimeters, and for imperial measurements, I will sew a scant 1/4 of an inch. Backstitch at the start and at the end, and use some tissue paper or tearaway stabilizer to help you if you need. Trim your threads, remove any of the tissue paper that you've used for support at the sewing machine. Press your seam allowances towards the back of the garment. You should have a nice small seam allowance, and you should not be able to see any of the trimmed seam allowance peeking through the seam. Next, we're going to sew the centre back of the garment. I would like you to firstly finish this using the overlocker or serger if you have one, ensuring that you don't cut any of the material away on both of the centre back edges for the garment and both of the centre back edges for the lining. If you don't have access to an overlocker or serger, then you could bind these seam allowances. Give the overlocking or serging a press if needed to achieve a nice finish. Next, we're going to sew the centre back of both the exterior as well as the lining. We're going to sew from the hem up to the notch marked on your pattern. This notch should be positioned on both the back pattern and the lining pattern. We will stop sewing at the notch and backstitch to secure. Pin and take your work to the sewing machine. Sew the 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, starting at the hem, sewing up to the notch and backstitching securely at the notch. Press the seam allowances open, complete for both the exterior and the lining. Before we join the lining to the exterior fabric at the neckline, we can work to finish the hem of both the lining and the hemband. You can complete your choice of hem depending on the fabric that you're working with. For this garment, I've chosen to complete a tiny rolled hem, otherwise known as a baby hem or a pin hem. But if you prefer, you can simply use a standard double folded hem, leaving a finished hem size of 5mm or a scant 1/4 of an inch, about 3/16. This is the hemming technique that I used on the lining in my How to Sew a V-neck A-line dress video. You're welcome to watch that video if you want to complete this same technique. Effectively, you can either press your fabric into this double fold and edge stitch close to the top edge at the sewing machine, or what I like to do is usually press up the full hem allowance, my 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch, and then create the double fold as I'm sewing it at the machine. Now let's look at how to sew this tiny rolled hem. The technique that we cover here is the same technique that we will need to use to finish the hem of the lining, the hem of the hemband, and the edges of the necktie. If you are new to sewing rolled hems, then you may wish to watch my linked tutorials for more detailed instructions. The first video is designed for complete beginners and goes over the rolled hem step by step. The second video focuses on sewing a baby hem in tricky fabrics. Both videos are linked here and in the description box below. I will start by pressing my hem allowance towards the wrong side. If you're working with a 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch hem allowance, then the amount you press needs to be smaller. I'm going to be pressing up a 1/4 of an inch or 7mm, because this will provide me with a finished hem of 2 to 3mm, 1/8 of an inch. You can press this up all the way around your hem, or you can simply turn the fabric over at the sewing machine. If you struggle with the fabric moving because it's on the bias, you can press it over a piece of straight cardboard. At the sewing machine, you want to sew a needle's width away from the folded edge of the fabric. Find a mark on your presser foot or on your sewing machine bed that helps you to achieve this consistently. In tricky fabrics, you may find it useful to place a piece of tissue paper or tearaway stabilizer underneath your work. That is what I'm going to be doing with this fabric. I will be sewing through my fabric and through my tissue paper at the same time, and the tissue paper or tearaway stabilizer will be removed at the end. Start sewing at the side seam or near the centre back of the hem and sew all the way around the garment. Once you've sewn the first seam, you're going to want to trim the threads, and you can give the hem a press in this position if you want to. You don't necessarily need to, it just depends on your fabric. Then you're going to want to take a small pair of scissors and trim away that seam allowance as close to the stitching as you can. You want to do this all the way around. And if you've been working with a fabric where you've used the tissue paper or a tearaway stabilizer, I recommend that you keep that on for the next step. Once you've trimmed the seam allowances away, we're going to go back to the sewing machine and complete the second seam. Now, whether you have tissue paper or not, the same rule applies. We're simply going to turn the hem over towards the wrong side of the garment by the width of the hem and what you've trimmed. It should be about 3 millimeters, an eighth of an inch in size. You're then going to sew directly on the seam that you previously sewed. If you have the tissue paper, it will be on top of the tissue paper. You can press it in position beforehand if you want to. At the sewing machine, start sewing at the centre back or one of the side seams of the hem. You are going to want to stitch either directly on top of the previous stitching or to the left of that stitching, ensuring that you're still catching the tiny hem. With the tissue paper, this can be harder to see, but the beginner's rolled hem video shows this very clearly without the use of the tissue paper. All the tissue paper is doing is providing another surface to help feed this material through the sewing machine better. However, it's worth having a test with the fabric that you're working with. Try a few different techniques to see which will give you the best results. And I discuss all of that in my baby hem video. Trim your threads and remove the tissue paper or tearaway stabilizer from your seam if you've used it. I gently pull both sides of the tissue paper strip at the same time to remove it from the stitching. You should achieve pretty good results doing this, but if I have any bits of tissue paper remaining, I usually get a pair of tweezers to remove them. Finish by giving your hem a final press. And here we have it, my finished rolled baby hem for my hemband, and I have also done this for the lining. While you are working with completing this baby hem, it might be a good idea to complete the technique on your necktie. Now for the necktie, you want to complete the rolled hem on the outside long edge all the way along, and on the long edge that will attach to the neckline from the centre back notches all the way to the end of the necktie. After completing both long edges, you would then complete the short edge of the necktie. When sewing the necktie that will attach to the neckline of the garment, you simply need to stop sewing your rolled hem at those centre back notches. You can cut at a slight 45-degree angle from the outsider edge of the tie in towards the centre back notch. Clip about 7 millimeters, a generous quarter of an inch, to release the material that will sew onto the neckline of the garment, providing you with this finished result. If you have cut your necktie on the bias, I would recommend using some tissue paper or tearaway stabilizer to provide support and to prevent stretching. Now that the hems have been sewn and we've completed the baby hem on the necktie, we will continue with the construction to join the lining and the exterior fabrics together. Take your exterior garment and position it with the wrong side facing out. Grab the lining and position this with the right side facing out. Position the lining inside the exterior of the top so that the right sides of the exterior and the lining are facing one another. Match the lining and the exterior together at the side seam, pushing the seam allowances towards the back of the garment. Pin the armholes together from the underarm up to the neck at the front and the neck at the back of the garment. Complete for both sides. Use a clover fork pin to match the underarm seams if needed. At the sewing machine, we're going to sew the armhole from one side all the way around to the other side using the seam allowance minus 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch. Complete for both sides. If you're working with a sheer fabric like I am, you may wish to trim your seam allowances down. And you could have planned this by cutting a garment with a smaller seam allowance in the first place, say 5 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to trim my seam allowances to a generous 5 millimeters or a 1/4 of an inch. I'm then going to clip into the seam allowances to release the curves around the armhole. Next, we're going to head back to the sewing machine to complete an understitch. Push the seam allowances towards the lining, use an edge stitching foot, and sew 2 to 3 millimeters, a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch away from the seam between the lining and the exterior fabric. If your materials are the same, like mine are, just double check that you're sewing on the lining side. Once you've completed a neat understitch, you're then going to want to press the armhole in position. Working from the lining side, you're going to want to see a very small amount of the exterior fabric peeking around the edge of the armhole. Press in position. Complete for both sides. Once both armholes have been sewn, we're then going to work to secure the centre back of the garment, attaching the exterior to the lining. Turn the garment at the neckline so that the right sides of the exterior and lining are facing one another. Align the centre back from the neckline down to the previously sewn centre back seam. Use a pin to ensure that the previous stitching for the centre back seam, where the notch is directly on top of one another in both the lining and exterior fabric. I usually like to push my seam allowances in both layers towards one side so that they're out of the way. Pin them in place. At the sewing machine, we are going to be sewing from the neck edge down this centre back seam line on the one side first, attaching the two layers together. We need to stop sewing at exactly this point or a stitch length before the previous stitching at the notch. We will then check our work and complete the same for the second side. Use your 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. At the end of the seam, you want to backstitch. Make sure that you don't go over the previous stitching. If anything, you're stopping a stitch before that mark. Check your stitching to ensure that you haven't accidentally caught the seam allowances or sewn too far. If anything, it's better to have a 1 stitch length gap than it is to sew too far. Turn the work to the right side to check your stitching. If you're happy, prepare the second side. Turn the work back so that the wrong side is facing out, the right sides are together. Turn the work over so that you're working on the left-hand side. Use the pin to match the stitching between the two layers, pin the seam allowances out of the way and the rest of the seam. Sew this as you did for the first seam. Before proceeding, double check your work and check that you haven't caught anything you shouldn't have. Press the seam allowances at this back neck opening, so from the neck to that notch on either side open. Then you can reach through to the neck and turn each of the sides back to have the right side of the fabric facing out. Once again, double check the back neck opening to check that you're happy with your stitching. Then we can work to press the back neck opening from the lining side of the garment, ensuring that the seam between the lining and the exterior is either sitting right on the edge of the back opening or ever so slightly coming towards the lining side so that the seam isn't visible from the right side of the garment. Give this a good press on both sides. Then we're going to move on to complete some top stitching. Now I've already gone ahead and done this on both of my armholes. The key here is that you want to choose the distance that you want to complete your top stitching. I'm working with 5mm or a scant 1/4 of an inch. I completed this around both of my armholes, sewing through my exterior and lining material. I also increased my stitch length to 3mm. Once you've worked on the armholes, we're then going to do the same thing at the centre back. We want to do this to the centre back opening to secure the two fabrics together there. And I'm also going to do it down the centre back of the garment so that I have a nice design detail running down the centre back. I'm going to start by doing it to my centre back, and I'm going to be doing this from the hem of the garment up to the opening on only the exterior fabric. To be consistent with the armholes, I'm going to want to sew the same distance away, 5mm or a scant 1/4 of an inch. Use an edge stitching foot or a guide on your presser foot on your sewing machine so that you're accurate with this. I also increased my stitch length to 3mm to match the rest of my top stitching. On one side, I started at the hem and sewed up to the centre back opening. For consistency with my top stitching, on the other side, I started at the back opening and sewed down towards the hem. The most important thing is that you start and stop on both sides at the same point, at the notch or the opening at the back. When you're working near the opening, you need to make sure that you are only sewing through the exterior fabric and the exterior fabric seam allowances, and that you're not accidentally catching the lining or another seam allowance. To start or stop at the back opening, you want to either sew one back stitch or my preference, which is to turn my stitch length down to 0 and sew over myself. This will keep the work looking neat. Instead of cutting my threads at the opening, I leave long thread tails there. This allows me to pull those threads through to the wrong side of the work and to tie them off securely. Finish with a trim. Check your top stitching and check that you've started and stopped at the same point of that back opening. Give it a press. Then we're going to work to top stitch the back neck opening. For this, we're going to be sewing the exterior and the lining materials together, sewing 5mm or a 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the fabric. You can sew in either direction, starting at the neckline or starting at the back neck opening. The important steps are to align your top stitching with the previous top stitching for the centre back exterior fabric at the back neck opening. To create a neat finish of the top stitching at the join, either sew a singular back stitch or reduce your stitch length to 0 and sew over yourself a couple of times. Tidy the threads by sending them through to in between the layers of material. Use a needle if you need to, and tie them off to secure. Once the top stitching is complete, it can be a good idea to add a small bar tack for security at the bottom of that back opening. I'm going to do mine with a small zigzag stitch on my sewing machine. My zigzag has a width of 2 millimeters with a stitch length of 0.4 millimeters. You need to sew this right across the bottom of the opening from one line of top stitching to the other. Complete a small back stitch at the start and at the end, or alternatively turn your stitch length and width to 0 and sew over yourself. It's also a good idea to pull the threads through afterwards and to knot them on the inside of the garment. You should be left with something that looks like this, a nice neat way to securely finish the top of the back opening and also to cover up that connection between the top stitching. Now we're going to attach the hemband to the top exterior. You want to make sure that you are matching the back of the hemband to the back of the garment and the front of the hemband to the front of the garment. I marked the back of my hemband with a pin. You need to position the right sides together, aligning the centre back, the side seams and the centre front. The seam allowances at the side seams need to go in the direction of the back. Use a clover fork pin to match the side seams together if you need to. You will then take this to the sewing machine and you will sew all the way around using your seam allowance. Mine is 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch. I will start at one of the side seams. Press the seam allowances open and then work to overlock them together. At the overlocker, I'm aligning my previous stitching with the marker for the left needle and I'm using my right needle only on the overlocker. This helps me to create a relatively small seam allowance that is overlocked or serged. Tidy your overlocking threads, thread them into a large-eyed needle and thread that back up the stitching. Then you're going to want to press the seam allowances away from the hemband towards the exterior and we're going to head to the sewing machine to top stitch them in position. We will be top stitching on the exterior of the garment, the same distance away from the seam that we've used in the other areas. Mine is 5 millimeters, 1/4 of an inch. Use the same stitch length too. Mine is 3 millimeters. Start at a side seam and sew all the way around. Back stitching once or twice, keep that to a minimum. An alternative method for attaching the hemband onto the garment is to use a French seam. Once you've sewn and top stitched the hemband, the final thing that we're going to need to do is to attach the necktie onto the neckline. We're going to want to attach the necktie onto the garment, matching the right sides of the material together. I recommend taking the front and the back pieces of the garment and marking the stitching line for the neckline onto the edge where they meet the armhole. Simply measure from the neckline the 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance and mark with chalk. You want to do this to both back and both front pieces. This will make it easier to pin onto the necktie. For your necktie, you will want to find the centre front. You may have marked this with a notch. If not, simply fold the necktie in half and mark with a pin or some chalk. Fold the front of your garment in half and mark the centre front with a pin or some chalk. Match the centre front of the garment to the centre front of the necktie, the right sides of the fabric together. Then you will work from the centre front out towards the armhole, pinning the necktie onto the front neck of the garment. Once you've attached the front, you can then work to attach the backs. Take the back and match the centre back with the back of the necktie. This is the area that you clipped where your rolled hem starts. You want the rolled hem to ever so slightly sit over the edge of the centre back so that the edge of the rolled hem will get caught in the stitching and the binding that we will apply. Work back from the centre back towards the armhole. At the armhole, you should find that the seam allowances of the front and the back overlap a little bit. I would recommend that you position the front on first and then the back on top. Although the seam allowances will overlap, the stitching lines shouldn't overlap. I recommend pinning on your exact stitching line and taking a look by turning it around to the right side. complete for both sides, and most importantly, make sure that the join between the top of the armholes and the necktie is symmetrical on both sides. If it's not quite right, you may need to move things. Once you're happy, you can then work to baste or tack this in place. I would recommend doing that just to make sure that everything stays in position as it should. I recommend that you baste or tack just off your stitching line. My seam allowance is 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch. We are going to be binding this neckline edge to finish it. If you are a competent sewer, you're welcome to attach one side of your binding now. However, I'm going to be following through the steps in an easier manner. So I will be sewing this first and then attaching my binding. Head to the sewing machine and sew your seam allowance from the centre back on one side all the way around to the centre back on the other side. Because you've basted or tacked the work, you shouldn't have any issues with anything moving. Backstitch at the start and at the end. When you've finished sewing, do check your work, especially if you didn't baste or tack things. You want to make sure that the join of the armhole is symmetrical on both sides, as well as the centre back. You can always measure from the opening on the centre back to the bottom of the necktie. If you're happy, you can remove your basting or tacking threads. Once you've removed your basting and tacking threads and you're happy with the seam that you've sewn, we're now going to move on to binding the seam to provide a neat finish. Decide on the size of your binding. I want a finished binding width of 5mm, a scant 1/4 of an inch. Therefore, I'm going to trim my seam allowances down. Use a ruler and chalk to measure and draw a cutting line onto your work, or simply cut freehand. I'm going to be trimming my seam allowances to a scant 5mm. Now it's time to prepare the bias binding. Take your piece of bias fabric. We're going to press this into a piece of double fold bias binding. You can use one of these bias binding makers. Feed your piece of bias into the binding maker with the wrong side facing up. It's easier to feed the piece of bias if you cut a 45-degree angle at the start. Use a pin to push through on the wrong side of the binding maker if you struggle with this. Work to pull your bias binding out of the binding maker and use your iron to press it in place. You want the maker to create you a single fold binding that's approximately 1/2 inch in size, 1.2 centimeters. If you don't have a bias binding maker, you can press your binding in half and then press each of the sides into the middle. Once you've got the size of your binding pressed that you like, you can use pins positioned into your ironing board to simulate the bias binding maker. I will create a more detailed video on cutting out and preparing bias binding, which I will link to here. Once your single fold binding is ready, you're then going to want to press it in half to create a double fold, pressing the wrong sides together. Now this is the important bit. Rather than pressing this in half perfectly, we are going to allow one side of the piece of binding to be slightly wider by 2mm, a 1/16 of an inch. Now we're going to apply the binding to the neckline. Take your neckline that you've trimmed down to a scant 5mm, 1/4 of an inch, and take your piece of bias binding. You're going to want to work with the side of the bias binding that is smaller to start with. You're going to want to open up the binding and position it so that this smaller side has the right side of the binding against the inside of the neck seam. You want to position the fold on the binding on top of the stitching line that you sewed previously, attaching the garment and the necktie together. You will have a bit of excess binding at either side of your centre back, and that's no problem. We'll trim that off once this is sewn. Work to pin this in position. You can baste or tack this in place if you want to. Otherwise, you can head to the sewing machine. At the sewing machine, you need to work to sew the binding onto the neckline. You want to be sewing on the fold line of the binding, which should ideally be on top of the previous stitching line. Sew from the centre back all the way across the neckline to the other centre back. Backstitch at either end. Once you've sewn the first side of the binding, you're then going to be able to fold the binding over the neckline seam, sandwiching the seam allowances inside of it. Because we have the wider side of the binding for the second side, you should find that it's easy to fold the binding over the seam allowance and that this second side will easily cover the neckline stitching. Finish the binding at the centre back by trimming the binding to a 1/4 of an inch, 5mm after the centre back.
Fold the binding by folding the centre back edge of the binding first and then refolding the unfinished edge of the binding to sandwich the binding in the same manner that the rest of the neckline is completed in. Pin in position. Pins should be going through the binding to catch the binding on both sides. Work to pin the second side of the binding in place around the neckline. You can choose to have your binding caught as an edge stitch on both sides of the binding, or you might choose to have it sewn in the ditch on one side and an edge stitch on the other side. Once you've pinned the binding in position, you can then work to baste or tack this in place. I would recommend that you do this extra step as it ensures that you have a perfect finish. You can work from this open side of the binding, or you can work from the other side of the binding and have the open side underneath. You will see that with this blue top, I applied the binding onto the neckline, finishing the edge with the necktie first. However, with the burgundy top, I finished the body or neckline edge first. It doesn't really matter which side you finish first because this binding isn't visible from the outside of the garment. Once you're happy with your hand-sewn basted stitch, you're then going to want to go to the sewing machine. We're going to be sewing from one centre back edge all the way around to the other centre back edge. If you have basted or tacked your binding, it doesn't really matter which side of the binding that you sew on. I used a piece of tissue paper or paper underneath my work to start so that my threads didn't get caught up under the bulk. For this example, I'm sewing on the sewn side and I have the side that is not sewn underneath. That's the longer side. I could choose here to either stitch in the ditch directly in the seam between my binding and my garment, or I can edge stitch directly on top of the binding, 1 to 2 millimeters, a 1/16 of an inch from the edge. It doesn't matter which technique you use, I'm using the edge stitching technique for this sample. Sew all the way along the neckline attaching the binding. When you get to the end, you will backstitch. If you want to, you can also stitch over the short edges of the binding to seal the centre back on both sides. You might need a piece of paper or some tissue paper underneath your sewing to help your machine here. Now your work's out of the sewing machine, you're going to want to check it and check that you've caught your binding everywhere. If you're happy, you can remove your basting stitches. Press the binding flat and then press the binding and neck seam allowances towards the necktie. We now have two final things that we need to do to finish this garment. The first one is that we want to anchor the seam allowances of the lining and the exterior material together at both of the side seams. Position your hand between the two layers of fabric and grab the side seams, approximately 5 centimeters, 2 inches down from the underarm. Position the two side seams directly on top of each other. Anchor with a pin and turn your work to the right side to check that you haven't pulled or distorted anything. If you're happy, take the work to the sewing machine and complete a bar tack or a basic backwards and forwards stitch a few times in the seam allowance to anchor them together, complete for both sides. The final technique that I would like you to use is a thread chain. I'm going to position a thread chain on both of my side seams, anchoring my exterior and my lining material together. I have a step-by-step tutorial on how to sew a thread chain if you wish to watch that. I'm going to position my thread chain about 2 centimeters, 3/4 of an inch up from my lining on the side seam. I will make my thread chain about 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters in length and anchor it onto the correct point on my exterior fabric seam allowance. What I mean by the correct point is that I recommend that you hang the garment to check that the two layers are in the correct position before anchoring it.
And there we have it, a finished tie neck halter neck top. Thanks for watching. I really hope you've enjoyed this class and been able to follow along to make your own garments. Do share the results if you've made one of these tops. Thanks very much for watching and I'll see you soon.